The coffee stain was still spreading across the marble floor when I heard his footsteps coming down the hallway, and I knew, before he even opened his mouth, that this was going to be a bad day. My name is Alina, and I had worked in Damian Cross's house for almost 2 years by then. Housekeeper, they called it on paper. In reality, I was the only person who dared to walk into rooms other staff avoided, who folded his shirts a certain way because he liked them that way, who learned that he took his coffee black except on the mornings after he came home very late, when he wanted 2 sugars and didn't want to be asked why. I had also brought my son, Noah, to work with me most days, because his daycare had closed down the month before and I hadn't found anywhere else I trusted. Damian never said anything about it. He simply looked at Noah the first time he saw him toddling across the hallway, said nothing, and went back to his study. I took that silence as permission. That morning, one of the kitchen staff had set a tray of coffee too close to the edge of the counter. It tipped. It spilled across a folder of documents Damian had left open on the table beside it, papers I later learned were worth more to him than most people's entire lives. He came down the stairs already furious about something else. A phone call, a meeting that had gone wrong. I never found out exactly what. And he saw the ruined papers and the stains still dripping onto the floor. And he saw me standing closest to it with a cloth in my hand. And he didn't ask a single question. "You did this," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Everyone in that house had learned that Damian Cross's quiet voice was more frightening than any shout. 2 years in this house and you still can't keep a room in order. "Mr. Cross, I didn't." "I don't want excuses." He picked up the ruined folder, water dripping from its corner onto his shoes, and his jaw was tight in a way I had only seen once before, the night 2 men in dark coats had come to the house and left an hour later looking pale. "Do you understand what this cost me?" I felt my face go hot. Behind me, I heard the small shuffle of sneakers on marble, and my stomach dropped because I knew exactly whose footsteps those were. Noah had been playing with his toy cars in the next room. He must have heard the sharpness in Damian's voice, because 2-year-olds understand tone long before they understand words. He came around the corner holding one small red car in his fist, looked up at the tall man in the dark suit, then looked at me, and I watched something settle behind his round eyes, not fear, which was what every adult in that house felt when Damian raised his voice, but something closer to concern. "Noah, baby, go back to the—" I started, but he was already walking forward, small steps across the marble, straight toward the man that grown adults twice his size would not look directly in the eye. He stopped in front of Damian, tilted his head all the way back to look up at him, and said, in the clear, unbothered voice that only small children have, the voice that has not yet learned what fear is supposed to sound like, "Say sorry to my mommy." The room went completely silent. I heard the cook, who had been standing frozen by the kitchen door, stop breathing. Somewhere behind me, one of the security men who had just entered the hallway went very, very still, as if bracing for something none of us wanted to see happen. Damian Cross did not move. I have replayed that moment more times than I can count since then, and I still don't fully understand what I saw cross his face in those few seconds. It wasn't anger, though anger would have made more sense to everyone watching. It was something closer to shock, the kind of shock that comes from being hit somewhere you didn't know you could still be hit. He looked down at my son. Noah looked back up at him, completely unafraid, still gripping his little red car, waiting. "Noah," I whispered, stepping forward, my hand trembling as I reached for his shoulder, terrified of what might happen next in a house where I had seen grown men apologize to Damian Cross with their eyes down and their hands shaking. "I'm so sorry, sir. He doesn't understand." "Don't." Damian's voice cut through mine, but it wasn't the same voice from a moment ago. It was quieter, almost unsteady. "Don't apologize for him." He crouched down slowly until he was almost at Noah's height, his tailored suit creasing at the knee, something I had genuinely never seen him do for anyone in that house before. Bodyguards, business partners, even once a man I later learned was a city official who came trembling to ask a favor. Damian Cross did not lower himself for people, and yet there he was, eye level with a 2-year-old holding a toy car. "You're right," he said to Noah. Just that. 2 words that seemed to cost him something enormous to say out loud, in front of his staff, in front of me. Then he looked up, past Noah, directly at me, and for the first time in 2 years working in that house, I saw something in his expression that wasn't distance or command or the careful blankness he wore like a second suit. It was almost like recognition. Like he was seeing me, actually seeing me for the first time. "Alina," he said, standing back up, straightening his jacket, though his voice still had that unfamiliar crack in it. "I spoke to you unfairly. That wasn't your mistake to carry." He glanced at the ruined papers still dripping on the table, then back at me. "I'm sorry." I don't think anyone in that hallway had ever heard those words leave his mouth before. I certainly hadn't. The kitchen staff exchanged glances I pretended not to notice. The security man by the door shifted his weight like the floor beneath him had tilted slightly. I didn't know what to say, so I said the only thing that felt true. "Thank you, sir." He nodded once, sharply, the way he did when a conversation was finished, and turned to leave, but he paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at Noah, who had already lost interest and gone back to rolling his car along the floor tiles. "Does he do that often?" Damian asked me. "Say things like that?" "He says whatever he's thinking," I admitted. "He doesn't know any better yet." Something flickered across Damian's face, not quite a smile, but close enough that I noticed it. "Maybe that's not a flaw," he said, and went up the stairs without another word. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep in the small room near the kitchen where we stayed, I found an envelope slipped under our door. Inside was money, more than I earned in 2 months, and a note, written in handwriting I recognized from the shipping labels and business documents I sometimes organized for him. For the coffee, and for what I said. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at that note, trying to understand a man who terrified an entire city but had knelt down on marble floor for my son. I had no idea then that the money and the apology were the smallest things he would end up giving us, or that in trying to understand Damian Cross, I was about to learn something about my own son's father that would change everything. The days after that were different, though I couldn't have explained exactly how at first. Damian still left before sunrise most mornings and came home late, still spoke in that clipped, controlled voice on business calls I wasn't supposed to overhear. But something in the house had shifted. He started acknowledging me when I passed him in the hallway. Small things, a nod, once even asking if Noah had eaten before he had. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was more like a wall with one brick removed, enough to see through to something that had been there the whole time, hidden. It was Marisol, the cook who had worked in that house even longer than I had, who first told me something that made the pieces of Damian Cross start rearranging themselves in my mind. "You know, he had a boy once," she said one afternoon, her voice low as she chopped vegetables, glancing toward the door out of habit. "Before you came, before any of us really except me." "A son?" I asked, my hands going still over the laundry I was folding. "His wife left when the boy was small, took him far away, changed her name, I heard. Damian never talks about it, never looks for them, not that I know of. But sometimes," she paused, choosing her words carefully, the way people in that house always did when discussing him. "Sometimes I catch him looking at children the way a man looks at something he lost and can't get back." I thought of the way he had crouched down for Noah, the unsteadiness in his voice, the note under my door. "How old would the boy be now?" I asked. Marisol's knife paused over the cutting board. "About the same as your Noah when he left, maybe a year or 2 older by now." I didn't sleep well that night, turning the thought over and over. It explained so much. The way Damian's face had cracked open at Noah's innocent demand, the way he had knelt down without thinking, the money slipped under my door that felt less like an employer's apology and more like something else entirely, something aching and unspoken. A week later, I found out I was wrong about one crucial detail, and it changed everything. I had gone into his study to leave a signed delivery slip on his desk, something I did most evenings when he wasn't home. I wasn't looking for anything, but a framed photograph had fallen face down behind a stack of books, likely knocked over during cleaning, and when I picked it up to set it right, I saw the picture inside. A woman, younger, laughing, holding a baby boy no older than 1. And beside her, unmistakably, a much younger Damian Cross, without the hardness that now lived permanently in his eyes, smiling in a way I had never once seen him smile in 2 years of living in his house. On the back, in a woman's handwriting, was a date and a name. Sophia, baby Theo, 3 months old. I set the photograph down exactly where I'd found it, my heart pounding, because something about that name, Theo, nagged at a memory I couldn't quite place. And it was only walking back to my room, past the small pile of my own belongings that had traveled with me from apartment to apartment over the years, that the memory surfaced fully, cold and sudden. My late husband's sister. Her name had been Sophia. She had disappeared from the family years before Noah was born, after a divorce no one in the family ever discussed, taking her son with her, changing cities more than once. I had never met her son. I had never even seen a photo. But I knew, standing frozen in that hallway with my hand against the wall, that if I was right about what I had just realized, then Damian Cross wasn't simply my employer. He might be my son's uncle. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on the edge of my bed with Noah's small chest rising and falling beside me, and I tried to talk myself out of what I was thinking, because it felt impossible, the kind of coincidence that only happens in movies, not in the life of a maid who cleaned floors to keep her son fed. But the name kept circling back. Sophia, Theo. My late husband, Marco, had mentioned his sister only a handful of times before he passed, always with a strange heaviness in his voice, always changing the subject quickly afterward. She married badly, he'd said once years ago when I'd asked why we never saw her at holidays. She got out before it got worse. We don't talk about it because it isn't safe to. I hadn't understood what he meant then. I understood now, sitting in the house of a man an entire city feared. The next morning, I made a decision I probably shouldn't have made. I waited until Damian was alone in his study, and instead of leaving quietly as I usually did, I knocked. "Come in." He looked up from his desk, surprised to see me standing there rather than simply passing through. "Elena, is something wrong?" "I need to ask you something," I said, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. "And I need you to be honest with me, even if it's not my place to ask." Something in his expression sharpened, the old wariness returning, the Mafia boss instead of the man who had knelt on marble for my son. "Go on." "Your wife," I said. "Sophia, and your son Theo, what happened to them?" The silence that followed lasted so long I thought he might have me removed from the house on the spot. His hands, resting on the desk, curled slowly into fists, not in anger at me, I realized, but in something closer to old grief clenching back to life. "How do you know those names?" he said. It wasn't a question, it was almost a warning. "Because I think," I said, forcing the words out before I lost the courage, "that Sophia might have been my husband's sister, and if I'm right, that would make Theo my son's cousin. And it would make you," I stopped, my throat tightening. "It would make you family to my son, even before any of this happened between us." Damian stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. For a moment, I thought I had made a terrible mistake, that I had crossed a line no one survived crossing in that house. Instead, he walked to the window, his back to me, his shoulders rigid. "Sophia left because of what I do," he said finally, his voice low and rough in a way I had never heard from him. "She was afraid for Theo, afraid he'd grow up in this world, or worse, become a target because of who his father is. I let her go because she was right to be afraid. I told myself it was the only kind thing I ever did for that boy, letting him grow up far away from all of this." He turned around, and his eyes, usually so controlled, were bright with something raw. "I haven't seen my son in 11 years. I don't even know what he looks like now." "Marco died 4 years ago," I said quietly. "He never told me exactly where Sophia went. He said it wasn't safe to know, but he kept a photograph of a boy, maybe 7 or 8 at the time it was taken. I have it in my things." Damian's jaw tightened, his composure fracturing at the edges. "Show me." I went and got it with shaking hands, the small worn photograph Marco had kept hidden in an old cigar box for years. a photo I had never fully understood the importance of until that moment. When I placed it in Damian's hands, I watched the most powerful, feared man I had ever known go completely still, staring down at the image of a boy with his own eyes, his own jaw, standing beside a woman he clearly still loved despite everything. "That's him," he whispered. "That's my son." And then, for the first time since I'd known him, Damian Cross's carefully built walls came all the way down, and I watched him cry. What followed those next few weeks was nothing like the quiet, orderly household I had grown used to. Damian threw the full weight of his resources I had only ever half understood, hearing them referenced in hushed phone calls and guarded meetings, into finding Sophia and Theo, private investigators. Old contacts he clearly hadn't spoken to in years, men whose voices dropped respectfully the moment they heard his name on the phone. For the first time, I saw the true scale of his power, not through fear, but through the desperate, careful way he used it to find the family he'd lost. It took 3 weeks. Sophia, it turned out, had settled 2 states away under a different last name, working as a nurse, raising Theo, now 19, tall, quiet, with Damian's same guarded eyes, in a small apartment far from anything resembling the life Damian led. The night before Damian flew out to see them, he found me in the kitchen, Noah asleep against my shoulder after a long day. "I don't know what to say to him," he admitted, standing in the doorway like a man far less certain of himself than the one who ran half the city's underworld. 11 years! What do you say to a son who doesn't know you at all?" "You don't need the right words," I told him, thinking of everything I'd watched change in that house since the day my son had walked up to him without fear. "You just need to be honest. He'll know the difference between a performance and the truth. Children always do, no matter how old they get." He nodded slowly, looking down at Noah's small, sleeping face against my shoulder. "He's the reason any of this happened," Damian said quietly. "If your son hadn't said what he said that day." "He didn't know who you were," I said. "He just knew someone had hurt his mother and it wasn't right. That's all it was." "That's everything," Damian said. "That's the only honest thing anyone's said to me in years." He left the next morning before sunrise, the same way he always left for business, except this time his hands were shaking as he got into the car, and I understood, watching him go, that some meetings mattered more than any deal he'd ever made in that world of his. He was gone 4 days. I didn't hear anything, and the silence gnawed at me more than I expected, given how quickly this man's family had become tangled with my own. On the 3rd night, I sat with Noah after he fell asleep and found myself praying, for the first time in years, that things would go well for a man I had once been terrified of. On the 5th day, a car pulled into the driveway, and I watched from the kitchen window as Damian stepped out, and behind him, hesitant but present, a tall young man who could only be Theo, and behind him, a woman with tired, careful eyes who I recognized immediately from the old photograph in the cigar box, older now, but unmistakably the same Sophia my husband had once loved and protected with his silence. I walked outside without thinking, Noah on my hip, and Sophia's eyes found mine across the driveway, widening with a recognition of her own, some family resemblance, some echo of her brother's face in mine, or maybe simply the understanding of 2 women who had both spent years protecting children from a world too dangerous to name out loud. "Elena," she said, her voice breaking on the single word, closing the distance between us in a few quick steps. "Marco talked about you. He always said you'd know how to find us if it ever mattered enough." I didn't have words either, just tears, standing in that driveway with my son on my hip, watching Damian Cross stand beside his own son for the first time in 11 years, both of them awkward, uncertain, but undeniably, finally together. That was almost a year ago now. Things didn't become simple after that. Damian's world was never going to disappear just because a family had been reunited in his driveway one afternoon. There were still guarded phone calls, still men who came and went from the house with the same wary silence, still a version of Damian Cross that the rest of the city knew and feared, the one who made decisions I still don't fully understand and probably never will. But in that house, something had permanently shifted. Sophia and Theo didn't move in, Sophia wasn't ready to give up the quiet life she'd built for her son. And Damian, to his credit, never once pushed her to. Instead, he built something slower and steadier. Monthly visits, long phone calls I sometimes overheard through his study door, birthdays that he now marked on a calendar he kept in his desk drawer, something I noticed the very same week Theo turned 20. I stayed on in the house, though my role had quietly changed too. Damian insisted, gently for a man who rarely spoke gently about anything, that Noah didn't need to be tucked away in a small staff room anymore. He set up a proper space for us, and more than that, he started showing up at odd moments just to sit with Noah while he played with his cars on the floor. The same floor where, almost a year earlier, a small boy had walked up to him without an ounce of fear and demanded an apology no adult in that house would ever have dared to ask for. Sometimes I catch Damian watching Noah with an expression I've come to recognize now. Not quite the grief I saw the day I showed him that old photograph, but something gentler, a kind of quiet gratitude that doesn't need to be spoken out loud. "You know," he told me one evening, watching Noah stack blocks into a wobbling tower on the study floor while Theo, visiting for the weekend, sat cross-legged beside his younger cousin, patiently rebuilding it each time it fell. I spent years believing that being feared was the only kind of respect worth having. It took a 2-year-old telling me to apologize to teach me I had that backward. I didn't have an answer for that. I didn't think he needed one. What I know now, almost a year later, is this. The coffee stain that started it all has long since been cleaned from that marble floor, the ruined papers replaced without another word ever being said about it. But the 4 words my son spoke that day, "Say sorry to my mommy," never stopped echoing through that house, through a family that had been broken apart by fear and quietly stitched back together by a child too young to understand what fear even was. Noah doesn't remember any of it now, of course. He was too small. When he's older, I'll tell him the story properly. How he walked up to the most feared man in the city and demanded he do the right thing, and how that one small, fearless sentence gave a father back his son, and gave my own boy a family none of us knew we were missing. Some nights, when the house is quiet, and I watch Theo teaching Noah how to stack blocks a little higher, or hear Damian's low laugh drifting from the study, a sound I never once heard in my first 2 years in that house, I think about how strange it is that the bravest person any of us ever met in that world of fear and power turned out to be the smallest one in the room. And I think Damian believes that too. Because every single night now, before he leaves for wherever business takes him, he stops by Noah's door just to check that he's sleeping safely, the same way, I imagine, he once wished someone had checked on his own son, all those years he couldn't. If you enjoyed this story and want to experience more exclusive Mafia stories, the full and complete version is now available on Patreon. Join the Valent family and discover the stories you won't find on YouTube. I've posted the full story on Patreon, and here's a little preview of what's waiting for you. If this story catches your interest, head over to Patreon and watch the full version there.